In the previous segment, I talked to you about the nature of government, discussing it as something coercive and something that uses the power of coercion to deter violence between individuals. And I have maintained, and it is true, that all governments, including our own government, are coercive. Yet we continue to find governments present all across the globe. So the question is, what can we do about this thing we've created? This thing that can only protect us by being coercive, and therefore, in turn, by coercing us. Well, the answer is that not all governments, while all governments are coercive, they're not all equally coercive, and that some are able to create a balance that protects the citizens without threatening them unduly. How do they do that? Well, the answer comes in the forms of government. Now, the issue of the forms of government is ancient. The discussion of the forms of government can be traced all the way back to a Greek philosopher named Aristotle, who about 300 years before the birth of Christ wrote books on the nature of government and talked about the fact that there were different forms of government. He came up with three. He came up with monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. And he pitched them in terms of the number of people who were in control. Monarchy, controlled by one person. An aristocracy, controlled by a few people. Democracy, controlled by many people. His argument went like this, that these three governments could be ranked in terms of how good they are. This may surprise you as an American where the ideology of democracy is so widespread, but Aristotle decided the best of all forms of government was a monarchy. He decided it was a good form of government and the best form of government because one person, if he were a good person, could make decisions quickly that would affect all society. Is there a threatening war? You've got one person in command who can direct the defense of the entire population. Good idea. And indeed, if we look in the basic religious tradition that's widespread in the United States, the Judeo-Christian tradition, you can look at an example of the king of Israel known as Solomon. Solomon, the wisest person there was a great king. And everyone would agree that he could just do a wonderful job all by himself. But the problem is, while you have a good king, and you might expect he'd raise a good family, you can't quite count on that. For example, Solomon. Solomon's a great king, but his sons were terrible, horrible, dictatorial types. So for Aristotle, the very best of the governments, a monarchy, would also turn out to be the very worst of the governments in the form of word tyranny. Now, how could you improve on that? Well, Aristotle said you could try to limit the dangers of a monarchy by having not one person, but a few people involved. That would be a kind of council of advisors or elders who would caution the monarch from making a big mistake and also would restrain him from abusing his power. Good thought. In some ways, Aristotle himself tended to speak highly of aristocracy as ways to manage government. But that then raises a question, but what if this group of people, this group of elders got together and decided to take advantage of their power by abusing their power? It would take more than one person like a monarch to do that, but if you think you couldn't have a small cabal or a gang that would get together and ruin everything, you haven't looked at very much of human history. So an aristocracy too can degenerate into a bad form of government. That bad form of government is often described as an oligarchy. So the second best government, the aristocracy, can degenerate into the second worst government, an oligarchy. Why is it the second worst? Well, it's the second worst because there is no honor among thieves, and those oligarchs can get together and stifle one another in their own greed. Well, how could we improve on that? Well, Aristotle said, well, I guess you could expand the number of people involved in government. You could have a democracy. Let everybody in on the act. Let them all rule. And that would mean there would be so many people involved that no small cabal, no small gang could run the whole government, and you'd have a much better government. Well, yeah, but even there, if you had half of those people, plus one or plus a few, you'd have a group that could take out their power on others. And certainly if you had any kind of racial marker, or some kind of ethnic marker, or a language marker, there would be nothing to stop even a majority in a democratic society from abusing their power. Another way of saying this is that even a democracy is subject to abuse. And then, of course, with democracy, you get something else. You get slow decision-making, the possibility of a gridlock in government, all of the things that we've been familiar with in our own democratic society. So this particular way of looking at government, counting only the number of actors who have power, has real limits. It doesn't quite tell us what we can do to create a government. And so we have, quite typically, particularly in the 21st century, decided that democracy is the safest way to go. It isn't the best form of government. It takes a long time. You have to talk with people all the time. There's a possibility of gridlock. But at least it's the least dangerous of the other forms of government. The quote that's most often used in this regard is a quote by Winston Churchill, who said, "Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others." But you know, we don't have to stop by just counting people. We can also do something else. We can look at government in a different way. We can look at the forms of government differently and ask certain questions about whether there could be limits placed on all governments. Could we have a government that had limits? Well, we could. There are certainly governments, though, that operate without limits. Totalitarian governments are notorious for having no limits at all. They all make the argument that they have to rule with an iron fist and they can't afford to have any limits at all. I suppose there are several totalitarian governments. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong, Saddam Hussein's rule in Iraq, all were totalitarian governments, one-person rule. That person ruled with an iron fist. He recognized no limit at all in his power. And going somewhat further back in history, there was a period of time, maybe 300 or 400 years ago, when some of the European heads of state, some of the kings or monarchs of Europe, claimed to have a divine right of kings. And they sought to rule with that kind of authority. But perhaps the expression of this idea that goes closest to the heart of what's wrong with totalitarian government was the position of Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler had himself named the Führer, der Führer of Germany, the leader, the only leader. And he made a virtue out of it. He said, listen, I'm better than any of those squabbling democracies like Britain and France and the United States. They're weak little countries that can't do anything because they're always fighting one another. Why? Well, because all authority is concentrated in my hands and I can act quickly and decisively. So you need to have a government with no limits at all. Okay? You'll recall he didn't win the war. Those weak democracies that only had the strength of the people behind them destroyed him in the end. But not before a great deal of cost was visited on the people of Germany and all the other countries that Hitler attacked. So, having a government without limits is a very great risk. And it's more than just the numbers of people who are involved. Because a totalitarian regime could be an aristocracy. It could also be a democracy. Indeed, think of it this way. Suppose you were in a situation where there wasn't much of a government, in which there were no authorities around, and the only thing that existed was a mob, a group of vigilantes perhaps, who decided you've done something terribly wrong and need to be strung up on the nearest tree. Is democracy the answer to your problem, if there's no limits on what this group can do? What are you going to do if you're facing a lynch mob? Do you say, let's vote? They've already voted. They've decided you're the target. They've got a knot in the rope and they picked the tree out. So even a democracy is subject to abuse if there are no limits at all. Now there are some governments that have managed to work, that create some limits in the form of groups. So a dictator no longer living, his government is no longer in place, but the government of Spain under Francisco Franco could arguably be argued to be an authoritarian government. Not truly totalitarian, because Franco ruled, yes, he was a dictator, yes, but he was responsive to major groups. He was responsive to the army from which he'd come. He was responsive to big business in society, which provided the money for him to afford his army. And he was responsive because he was a faithful Roman Catholic. So he responded to the church, the army, and the major governments. That's a form of limit, yeah. But certainly we're not very satisfied. And certainly if you're not somebody protected by one of those three groups, well, you don't have a group to back you up. The final answer is that among the forms of government, it is possible to have a rule of law government, a government in which law creates the limits. Now you have something that might work. Of course, it could work with a monarchy. You could have a rule of law monarchy. The argument about Solomon would be that he was a rule of law monarchy. He was ruled by divine law, or divine law as he knew it to be. He was acceptable. You could have a group of aristocrats who followed the law. One could argue that the Roman Republic was an aristocracy. They had slaves, but they couldn't vote. So they were an aristocracy and they followed the law. It degenerated into the Roman Empire, but that's another story. And then finally, it's possible to have a democratic regime which has the rule of law. Most typically, these are called a constitutional democratic government. That's the kind of government that I'm going to try to describe for you in this class, because the best, most accurate description of the government of the United States is not that it's a democracy. That doesn't give me insecurity at all, because every single dictator, Mao Zedong in China, Stalin in Russia, Hitler in Germany, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and Kim Il-jung, whichever Kim we've got currently in North Korea, they all claim that they rule with the support of the people. They're all democratic leaders, and they're such good democratic leaders they don't have to bother to have elections to see if another leader might be preferred. Democracy in and of itself is not the answer. A constitutional democracy, however, would be a good and useful thing to have. What does it take to have a constitutional democracy? In the next segment, I'm going to describe 4 principles that are essential to a constitutional democracy. The principles are majority rule, minority rights, freedom of expression, and the rule of law. And we'll take that up in the next segment.